Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Frontline Club, and thank you for coming tonight. Before I hand you over to our chair for this evening, Martin Bell, if I can just ask you to switch your phones to silent. And when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because we are broadcasting live this evening. So over to Martin.
Thank you all for coming. I'm not surprised to see it's a full house. It's an interesting book. Not because I'm in it. It's an interesting book, period. And it raises some interesting issues about whether and how far, and if at all, reporters cross the line, issues of impartiality and so on. I'll introduce the panel, which is not quite as originally advertised because Lindsay Hilsum is in Nairobi for obvious reasons. We're extraordinarily fortunate to have Penny Marshall of ITV News, who plays a very leading part, and properly so, in Chapter 1. Stewart Purvis, the author of the book and the prime mover. Jeff, the co-author, I think I can say without whom it certainly would be in its present form. And dare I say, our star turn, Freddie Forsyth. We were young reporters in the BBC in 1964. He was the assistant diplomatic correspondent. But before he did that, we once covered a rail crash in Kentish Town from opposite sides of the same train. The BBC was mob-handed even in those days. We'll go a couple of times around the panel, but mostly this is yours to raise the issues that you want to raise. Stewart, this book is entirely your fault. Why did you write it and how do you feel about it?
Well, Martin, it was 10 years ago. I'd been at ITN for 31 years, started as a junior producer, ended up as the editor-in-chief and chief executive. I thought that was quite long enough to work in any one place. I basically decided to do something else, but wasn't quite sure what it was. I got two phone calls. One was from City University saying, how would you like to be a kind of one-day-a-week professor? So I said, that sounds fun. And I got a phone call from some people who said, we are a committee whose job is to administer a fund created by a former student at Oxford who would like to create an endowment for two professorships. One would be in his name, and the other would be in the name of his company, which is how I became the News International visiting professor at Oxford University. And during my 4 lectures that year, I was approached by a woman who rejoices in the name of the Rupert Murdoch Professor of Communications. Deborah Cameron, she jokes saying she should be the Rupert Murdoch Professor of Intercepted Communications. And she said, you know, I've been at your lectures, I think there's a book in them. So I thought, that's very kind of you. But I'd never got round to writing it, and along the way I'd met Jeff, partly when we were at ITN and partly because he worked together with me on the Oxford lectures. And I realised that Jeff could find things out from archives that other people couldn't, and I thought that was a useful skill to have. And then I went and worked full-time to Ofcom, and I finished at Ofcom, and I thought, well, I won't write the book, but maybe there's a radio programme. So I pitched a radio programme called... I had a very convoluted title, and the BBC came back to, we like the programme, let's call it When Reporters Cross the Line. So I said, fine. That gave Jeff and I extraordinary access to the BBC archives, both written and audio and video, which is where I first saw a video of Freddie Forsyth in a village in the middle of Biafra. And those who've read the book will know that I joined the BBC shortly after Freddie left, but the stories were already sort of building. And I'd heard these things about Freddie, and I watched this video, you know, God knows how many years later, and I think, actually, that looks like pretty straight reporting to me. So I became more and more intrigued. Jeff and I wrote a sample chapter actually about Freddie, sent it to a literary agent who buggered us about for months and months, asking us to rewrite. And in the end, he told me, I don't want to be a literary agent any longer. And I said, I could see why. You've got buggered us about. So I just sent it to Ian Dale. Now, you will know Ian Dale yesterday, because he's the man who grabbed that bloke on Brighton Pier and had a dog savaged him. He's also Damien McBride's publisher, and he quite rightly spent more time on Damien McBride's book than he has on ours. But fortunately, other colleagues at Bite Back have actually got behind the book, and we've had some nice reviews, so we're doing fine, and we're really grateful, Martin, that you, one of the victims, if you like, are here, and Freddie as well. About what I've discovered, the line... No one, that's a phrase that's regularly used in journalism, crossing line, but no one's ever defined what the line is. It turns out, I think we found there are lots of lines, and the different chapters illustrate different lines. The fact that I was an editor who became a regulator, because for about 3 years I was the content regulator at Ofcom, effectively I was the British regulator of TV and radio. I kind of came away thinking, well, regulation, we need certainty, we need precision in regulation, and in a sense that's partly what the Leveson process has been about. But I suppose writing the book has told me that regulatory precision is unlikely, to be brutally honest. There are grey areas all over the place. Even defining what due impartiality means is actually extremely difficult. So we called the book, the subtitle, The Heroes, the Villains, the Hackers and the Spies. The hackers is obviously slightly appropriate in view of my News International professorship. But I think in the end, I don't know about Jeff, and he can talk to this, I think we came away thinking that actually some of the villains we thought of actually turned out to be heroes, and maybe wish one or two of the heroes have turned out to be villains.
Actually, we'll go to... But the book, by the way, is here, and it is a very good read. Jeff, let's go to you next, because without you, it wouldn't have happened.
Okay, well, Stewart gave me this wonderful opportunity to find excuses to go into archives, which is really where I feel happy and where I can find things out and just follow facts in files and work out where other facts might be in other files. But it also gave me an opportunity, because this really hasn't been my background. My background was in newsreels, to look at journalism and look at issues in television and radio in particular, but also in the print. And the more I looked, the more fascinated I became. And at the same time, the more interested I became in issues about crossing lines, and where journalists such as one of our subjects, Walter Duranty, seemed to think that it was okay to know facts, to discover them, but then it wasn't okay to actually tell the readers what facts were discovered. You could pass them on to diplomats and other journalists, but just don't pass it on to the readers. And I've got a sort of difficulty with that. But equally, one of our other subjects, Guy Burgess, just left me breathless, because he turned in an act for the best part of 2 decades where he was a spy, he was a producer for the BBC, he was a counter-spy for MI5, he was a spy for MI6 as well as the KGB, and he was a drunk, and he was profligate in his social graces and favours, and he just carried on doing it, and I just couldn't imagine anyone that I've ever met that could do that. But there was also one other thing. We cover in a chapter 2 journalists who refused to reveal their sources and went to prison. And of course, this is a noble act. It's a fundamental principle. Don't reveal your sources. But of course, there have been all these rumours ever since that maybe they made the stories up. And the more I've looked into this, in particular, and Stewart and I have discussed what's come out of the archives, it has looked a little more debatable whether in fact these stories that they made them up are actually holding water. But what struck me more than anything else, and I thought of this as I was coming here tonight, is that at no point did the lawyers ever put to the journalists, "You've made it up, mate." They never said, in great lawyer fashion, "Sir, you are a humbug. You are a fabricator, a liar, aren't you?" Never said it. Just allowed the innuendo to percolate. And at the same time, if they'd said it, maybe that would have destroyed their careers and forced them to say, well, either yes we did or no we didn't, rather than put them in prison.
Our lineup is not quite as originally advertised as Lindsay Hilson of Channel 4 News, for obvious reasons, is in Nairobi. We're extraordinarily fortunate to have Penny Marshall, who plays a leading part in chapter 1 of this. It's all about living Marxism and all the ordeal that these guys went through. And if the great Bill Deeds, the editor of the Telegraph, had a category of news items which he called the marmalade droppers. And the marmalade dropping moment for me in chapter 1, well, I'll pass it over to Penny, is John Simpson's witness statement on behalf of living Marxism. You say what you like, Penny.
Well, Stewart, was with me all the way through the libel action which happened, which was really a result of being accused of crossing the line, along with Ian Williams and, in fact, the entire company, I would say, by the time they'd finished, because we were accused of profoundly misleading and deliberately misleading reports we filed from northern Bosnia. There isn't a more serious accusation. It goes to the heart of what we do. The motives were variously, I was in it to win it, that I was vain, I wanted an award. More pernicious, that we had inherited the sort of pro or anti-Serb agenda and had gone out deliberately to back up the government, to annoy the government and be pro-Muslim, and found, I think the phrase was, to see what we wanted to see and what wasn't there. So either way, you could argue we'd done it on purpose or we'd done it by accident, but we certainly crossed a line. Well, what ensued was some of the bravest defending of our journalism, and I'm sitting here, but there were 14 people with me, and also Ed Vullamy of The Guardian, who was by my side when the most controversial sequence was filmed and the interview took place with a very emaciated man behind a barbed wire fence who was a prisoner. What I learned from reading your marvellous book about that I find it quite difficult because I was so involved in it to be dispassionate about it, was that I didn't cross a line, we didn't cross a line, but actually arguably the subject of the chapter, John Simpson, did. He's not here to defend himself. I can't talk about his motives, but it's a fascinating chapter, and when you read his witness statement and the presumptions and the accusations that he makes, you can only remember that he wasn't there, so he didn't know what happened. And in my view, I would argue that he crossed the line. Did I? Absolutely not. I was never, I don't need to say this, I've been through a court case, which it was for 3 weeks I was in the dock, and I love your conclusion. What is the best way to hold journalists to account is to make them defend themselves publicly, and anything that they do, they have to, if they can't do that, they shouldn't do it. And of course, when you're in the field, these lines are blurred. There are blurred lines, and that's the brilliance of this book. I didn't know exactly where the lines were before, and I don't now, and you accept that. They're easy for regulators, they're easy for academics, they're not in high-stress situations. And you have to rely on the journalists, really, the seasoned judgment of the journalists, to call it. I was not impartial. By that I mean my report was devoid of bias. I think that's Richard Sandbrook's view. I did not carry bias with me. My reports were not neutral. I certainly took a viewpoint, and that was clear. I was involved. I held the hand of a small child who was lost. I remember at the time, before all the rest of the storm hit, there was a little bit of unease at ITN about that. There was a day when we weren't allowed to touch. Do you remember that? Don't touch anyone on screen, because it looks like you're...
Don't shake hands anyway.
You're involved, you're taking sides. But, I didn't know the cameraman was filming it, and this poor child was lost, and I just held him, and that was you. So I showed I cared, but we're not robots. If you don't care, don't be a journalist. I mean, that's got to be the kind of first motivation, is to try and shine a light. But did I cross any lines? Did I give evidence in The Hague? No. Lindsay Hilsum, who sadly is not here because she's yet again doing fantastic journalism, she did, and there's a very interesting chapter on why she did, and I think that her reasons are perfectly legitimate, and I agree with her. But in my case, I didn't feel I could add anything. We gave our tapes to The Hague. I'm not sure I agreed with that at the time. And, of course, it was sharing the tapes with the defence counsel for the war criminal, and he was a war criminal, he was sent down and found guilty, but sharing our rushes with the defence team was where the original accusation that we had misled came from. Because, of course, if you become part of the prosecution, you become part of the narrative, and it was essential to discredit myself and Ed Vullamy and Ian Williams and our company, to discredit the prosecution case in The Hague. So I'm still not sure that was the right decision, although these lines are difficult. but I chose not to get involved in The Hague, and I think that was the right decision, so I didn't cross that line. There's one ethical line that I put out there, which isn't in the book, which always bothered me. I never worried about where offence was. I never worried about whether people apologised to me or not. If they're going to apologise to anyone, they should apologise to the victims whose relatives are still missing because they denied them what happened to them. I don't need an apology. I got a little bit of money from the High Court and a vindication thanks to the support of my bosses. But I've always worried that some of the people who were in our report lost their lives because of it. Because in our endeavours to show our viewers what was happening, we asked people to tell us what was happening with a camera on them. And there were Serb guards around all the time. And at one point, one of the individuals said to me, I can't tell you the truth, but I can't lie. And on another occasion, the doctor in one of the camps said, I can't tell you the truth in front of that man. And I asked the man to leave. And as soon as he walked out of the door, the doctor said, they're going to kill me now. And I said, I'll get him straight back. I've made the most terrible mistake. And he said, no, we've discussed this. I'm prepared to risk my life. And he gave me the roll of film. And afterwards, I know for a fact 231 prisoners were taken from the men who were standing behind that fence. And in what the Serbs tricked them was going to be a prisoner exchange, they executed them at Mount Vlasic. And some of them were the men who we'd spoken to. And now that's an ethical question. How much should I have endangered them in such a way to expose a greater truth? That's the line that worries me. The rest is for academics and regulators. I was neither impartial nor and didn't cross that line. And when you're in the field under high pressure, you can only rely on your judgment and your experience and all the support. Good management comes out of this book too as well, actually. The right phone calls. Have you got the evidence? What are you going to say? What exactly are you going to call them, Penny? You know, there was no loose management, and that's really helpful when you're in the field. But blurred lines, to quote a modern song.
Thank you. One of the interesting issues here is whether journalists should be witnesses in war crimes tribunals. Some are, some aren't. I've done it 5 times. You can argue it either way. No disparagement to all the rest of us, but our star turn in many ways is Frederick Forsyth. He has and deserves an entire chapter to himself. Better known these days as a brilliant thriller writer, but where did he get it from? Our former assistant diplomatic correspondent, the man who was assigned by the BBC to cover the Nigerian civil war, and for one reason or another he did, and he was, can we say, reduced to the ranks, and he was busted to be a general reporter like me, and I've always thought of all the journalists I've known, Kurt Schork, all kinds of wonderful people, I know nobody who ever showed more moral and physical courage than the old guy in the white suit here. Freddie, can you keep it less than half an hour, please? Can you briefly say what happened to you and what you now think?
Yeah, I'll get as succinct as I can. Well, as to crossing a line, I've actually crossed 3 lines. The first one was when I accepted the post of assistant diplomatic correspondent of the BBC at the age of 28, which is unnaturally young, and for some offensively young. And I didn't realise I had made quite a number of enemies inside the hierarchy. A slight digression, if I may, the so-called British establishment. It's once said of the devil that the most cunning thing he ever did was to deny he existed. MI6 used to be exactly like that, not what we remember best, when there was apparently no secret intelligence service in Britain. Now, of course, we not only know that there is, we know where it is, we know who the boss is, but there was this, we remember when this was terra incognita. But anyway, there is a British establishment, denied though it may be. I, at 28, did not realise how cynical, how manipulative, and when crossed, how cruel it could be. I learned later, the hard way. that was the first line. What I had done inadvertently was to join the establishment. What I was not prepared to do, and didn't realize that it was assumed I had done it, was serve it. And that was where the second line got crossed. The second line was when I realized that I was going to be asked to participate in managed news, that the output on that subject, Nigeria Biafra, from the BBC was strongly biased in favour of the establishment, which insisted on a very strongly pro-Nigerian federal bias in all its agendas. That was when I walked. I should have given 3 months' notice. I didn't. I actually walked on a Friday night. I wrote my letter of resignation. I posted it in the late night mail, knowing it would arrive on Monday. On the Saturday, I flew to Portugal. On the Sunday, I hitched a lift, squatting on a cargo of mortar bombs into Biafra. I had actually come back to where I'd started, but I hadn't come back as the BBC's assistant diplomatic correspondent. I'd come back as a self-declared rebel. The third time I crossed the line was absolutely deliberate, but it wasn't about Biafra or the political faring or fortunes of the former eastern region of Nigeria, which is a highly political question and didn't really, I felt, concern me. I crossed the line when I realized that the children were dying, and they were dying in large and increasing numbers. They weren't dying of bullets. There were some who died of bullets, of bombs, but they were the minority. This was, in my view, a deliberately concocted and organized famine. We've seen famines since, that normally when the crops fail, when the rains don't come, or possibly there's an earthquake or a volcano or an inundation of some kind, and people starve. But this was deliberate. This was in the manner of those organized famines that Stalin organized, for example, in the Kuban and the Black Earth country. The children began to die in Biafra about April 1968. Now, the war began on July the 7th, 67. So these are two issues. And it was about late March, April, some of the mothers in the deep bush began to present themselves at clinics run mainly by the Catholic missionaries, carrying with them their rather deformed children. They were deformed not because they were born that way, but they had been reduced to stick insects with lolling heads and unglazed eyes and big, bloated, but only air-bloated bellies. And the mothers couldn't understand why this was happening. They said that they fed them regularly. And they did indeed, but what they were feeding them was gari, which is pounded cassava, and yams, both of which will fill you up, but they have got not 1 milligram of vitamins or calories inside them. They are carbohydrates. And this was a starvation caused by a complete lack of any kind of sustenance. Children need 5 grams a day of pure protein, and adults 1. That's why the children died. The story wasn't a story then. Biafra was, so to speak, the non-story. The Western world was concerned with many things, principally Vietnam, but this systematic destruction of a people who were part of the Commonwealth was a non-story. A group of journalists came down from Britain in the May of that year and for the first time saw and took pictures. And it was those pictures that transformed the story. And I found myself willy-nilly the resident, so to speak. I'd arrived in February, and I stayed until Christmas Eve '69. So in all 2 years, 3 months as a servant of the BBC, and then the rest of the time, 21 months as a freelance. In the sense that, yes, I did everything I could to try and raise awareness levels and possibly donation levels because of the plight of those children. I have absolutely no hesitation in pleading guilty, and proud of it. So 3 lines. I didn't mean to become a member of the establishment, but I absolutely refused to become its servant. I did mean to leave the BBC because it was either that or become part of a structure that I felt was parlaying managed news. And I definitely changed across the line when I decided to do all I could, not much, freelancers pretty way down the pecking order, but nevertheless do what I could to raise awareness levels inside and outside this country and eventually across Europe and North America for the plight of those children. Well, as it happened, 500,000 at least died, and the war, as you know, eventually ended in the crushing of the insurrection. But there's one thing that has stuck with me ever since, and it is my belief that it's one of the most shameful episodes our normally humane country and normally humane government have ever participated in, for this reason. If you take, as one must, that the secession, the UDI of the eastern region of Nigeria was illegal, then the Biafrans throughout the whole duration of that conflict were Nigerians. The government of Nigeria, therefore, was killing its own citizens. Secondly, the government of Nigeria was not a democracy. It was a very violent military junta that had come to power through an extremely violent coup d'etat in July 1966. You may like to ask yourself a rhetorical question: when in our long history has our government ever assisted a dictatorship to kill its own citizens? And the answer is never, save once. And the second question you might care to ask is why? Why did we assist a government that was no better than Bashar al-Assad to slaughter its own citizens for the crime of going into insurrection against them after numerous persecutions? Why did we do it? I know the answer. It was because of the massive vanity of the senior mandarins of the civil service who could not and would not be proved wrong. And that, I think, is shameful. I've never forgotten, I've never forgiven. Sorry, too long.
I cannot, thank you, I cannot remember an occasion when the Frontline Club was better justified in these last 5 minutes. Thank you, Freddie. It's very difficult now because we were in this is a predominantly young audience, and I hope you care about it, but these raised issues that have been with us ever since. And by the time Freddie had finished, and Jerry Seymour, and others who were there at the time, and John St. Jorre, the behaviour of the British government in that war, both in supplying the federal government with all its arms, and even mercenary pilots. The Nigerian Civil War was a big issue, I'm talking about 1968, even than Vietnam. We're going to open it up very soon. Stewart, what does this, because it's your book, what does this tell you about these issues of whether we should just stand back and say on the one hand, on the other hand, only time will tell? Yeah. Come on, let's have it.
Well, I think when I started the book with Jeff, the plan was that Professor Purvis, former regulator, would give his judgment. At the end of each chapter, there would be a kind of, here's the judgment. And we pretty soon went off that idea. And then what we did instead was to come up with almost an appendix of kind of, particularly for young journalists here, a kind of one-page guide to how to try to get through this stuff. But as Penny said, with the final conclusion we have, and it was slightly inspired by some of the things we'd observed during Leveson, is if you are Freddie Forsyth and you believe that what you did was right, as Freddie did, you stand up and say it, you take the criticism, you respond to the criticism, the criticism may come from your peers, it may come from, in the days of social media, it will come from, tweets and things like that. And if you've got a strong case, you have actually nothing to fear. If, on the other hand, this is done through skullduggery or all sorts of, covers, or you're not honest about what you're doing, then you have, in a sense, breached your sense of trust with your readers. If you're completely transparent about what you've done, I don't think you've anything to hide.
Let's open it up. We'll wait for a microphone. There's one all the way down here. Any issue may be raised? Almost.
For the benefit of those of us who have not read the book, could you explain a bit about John Simpson's statement, which I believe the judge looked at and threw out because it was not...
Yes, I think that's because we've got some people in the audience who've may have had a chance to read the book, some haven't. So basically, there was a group of people, and I have to say, I totally understand why there were some people who thought it was wrong for ITN, for Richard Tate, the editor-in-chief, and myself as the then chief executive, to take a legal action. But as I was talking to some students at City University the other night, I said, what else could we have done to nail the lie that Penny and her team and Ian Williams had faked the story? What other vehicle was there, if you like? So we went to the court, and there were people, and I think Harold Evans was one of them as well, and Roy Greenslade, who's here and may go on to add to that. They criticised us for doing that. And actually, I totally understand it, and funnily enough, I have no problem with that. That is a right. What John decided to do was to go further than that. He decided that he would write a witness statement in support of the magazine. Okay. Now, that witness statement was submitted to the court in private. It was also submitted to us as the other side in the discovery of documents. And when we read this statement, we could not believe what we were reading. We could not believe that I think he was probably then the diplomatic or the World Affairs editor of the BBC, was basically saying that we had faked a story when he wasn't there. He had no way of knowing, frankly, whether we had or hadn't faked the story. But based on his experience, and there was one line that stood out, and it's in the book, it said that these reporters had misled the world on one of the major stories of the decade. And if you think about it, that's about as serious as you can get. The judge looked at it and threw it out straight away. He said, well, he wasn't there, so I don't quite know how he can... So that document remained in our drawers since that day. And this book seemed to be an appropriate moment in which it could get an airing.
It's worth adding that he has apologised.
I was going to ask you whether you talked to him about
To
it.
be fair, he reviewed a book that Ed Vullamy wrote not very long ago, 6 months ago, in which he said that the case was unanswerable of what happened in the camps, and the phrase was he was profoundly sorry. I mean, it was a full apology for his actions. So we can leave it there. He has apologised, but it was an awful moment reading the witness statement, and I would say to young journalists, he never approached anybody at ITN about our version of what happened, ever. None of the 14 people or any member of management or anybody in the newsroom. It was entirely based on what he was told by our critics. So if you don't want to cross the line, it's always worth checking with the other side.
I hope is it Roy Greenslade?
It is. Yeah.
Please, thank you.
I want to make a public confession here. Why did I support living Marxism in this case? Not because, unlike John Simpson, I didn't make a statement about it being wrong, but my concern was that a media organisation, a large one, was actually squashing a little nut like living Marxism. And I didn't think, and don't think, that journalists and media organisations should use our disgraceful libel laws. So that's my starting point and my only point. But in reading Stewart's book, what struck me was something that struck Richard Ingram's many years ago, which is that there are occasions, even if you don't wish to use the libel laws, when there is such a need to do so, so overwhelming, that you do. And what was interesting about your book and that chapter was that you showed how what John had done and what other people did was build up such a feeling that ITN and my colleague Ed Vullamy, who never actually spoke to me until recently, until I apologised. I knew he was bubbling away, loathing me for what I'd done. I got a very handsome note from him recently. But what that did was showed that such was the weight of anti-ITN material that it was necessary for you to correct that on behalf of Penny and the others, and that's why in the end I stepped back from the breach. Richard Ingrams once said to me, I would never use the libel laws, but say this, say I was accused of being an anti-Semite, And then people repeated that I was an anti-Semite. And it took off that I was an anti-Semite when I wasn't. I'd feel it then necessary to crush that by using the libel laws. And I think you did exactly the same, that it had taken legs, this idea that you'd actually engaged in the wrong kind of journalism. So, fair play to you. I am glad to have offered my apologies and in these circumstances. And, you know, there we are. That's the truth.
Can I say, Roy, it's gracefully and gratefully accepted, and thank you in the way you've done it. And I know Penny,
it means a lot.
and also I should say Richard Tate, who also bore. In fact, Richard took a lot of the load, and I can remember the time that the jury went out happened to be the day of an ITN board meeting, and I was sitting there faced with the shareholders of ITN, and I thought, well, if this jury comes back the wrong way, I will leave this room and never come back. And Richard was in the same position. But I have to say the jury did the right thing.
Stewart, it comes over in your book. This could have brought ITN down, couldn't it?
I think it probably would have brought us down. Yeah, I think it was. So let's be honest, it was a gamble taking a legal action, but the best thing that our lawyer ever did was to say, I'm going to put every single one of you in the box. So we were all dragged in. I mean, I think the other side trying to make a joke of this. You know, is anyone you're not going to call as a witness? So, you know, this sound recordist was a witness, the sort of driver was a witness, but the witness that really counted was the doctor,
Who I mentioned.
who we brought over, and frankly, after he gave evidence, they might as well have shut the case down. It was so overwhelming, and you know, there was not a single reporter in court that day. Not a single reporter in court that day. So it was never reported.
Right, next. Microphone at the front, please. Thank you.
I can see something significant as that just happened. But it reminds me when I worked at the BBC on stories that involve court cases. And it'll only take 2 seconds. I know the backstory to this. But can you just, for those, because I'm here with some young journalism students, in 2 minutes just explain the beginning, you know, what happened, I know, but, you know...
What, you mean how the story came about in the first place? I totally understand. Shall I have
shouldn't take too
I'll do a
long,
quick
I know there's
version.
people here
So-
who do know.
We will get onto the larger issues,
exactly.
but this has to be
So-
answered. No, that's good.
No, actually, Penny, you do it, because you were there. You better.
The Bosnian Serbs were accused of running, as part of their ethnic cleansing operation, of running organised removal, murder, and of Bosnian Muslims, so that they could have the country could be organised into ethnically clean areas. And the reports came out that they were running a systematic murderous campaign. ITN were the first people to access the camps that had been set up, and we did so thinking that the reports of anything worse than just war kind of chaos had been exaggerated, and we established that there was organised removal and murder, and our reports didn't go that far because we didn't have the objective evidence, but what we were able to show and establish was enough to alert everybody internationally to something very grave happening. There was a huge amount of international attention. The White House had a press conference. The International Red Cross sweeped in. The camps were all closed down. It was a massive moment. 3 or 4 years later, because we gave our tapes to the tribunal, we were accused of making a refugee camp where people were free to come and go in the chaos of war look like a concentration camp where people were being killed by the way we'd filmed it. That was a lie, and it was established to be a lie, but it took off. And as well as ITN's reputation, the truth, what Ed Vullamy called poisoning the well of history, if those people, and they've just discovered a mass grave actually last week, where they believe there are 900 bodies from one of the camps where they were executed. If that had taken off, that would have forever poisoned the well of history. So we did it to defend our reputations, but also I think there was a we went and kind of risked everything to expose the bloody thing, and then we weren't going to have a bunch of idiots, and they were portrayed as these sort of radical, really, little spunky little magazine. They weren't going to poison the well of history. And just the last thing, for the record, they went bankrupt the next day, so there was no sort of big payoff for us.
Freddie, this
Can
was...
I, Martin, it's a PS, but I should say, if any BBC correspondent had a right to be pissed off that ITN got that story, it's Martin Bell. And you have never heard this guy ever complain about it. So to me, he's the other hero of the story.
I would like to... Freddie, this is 25 years after you left the war zones. How did it resonate with you? You saw this stuff?
What stuff?
The Bosnian War?
Oh, gosh, yeah. Well, I guess I'd left journalism by then, effectively.
No, it hasn't left you, though, has it?
No, I don't think it ever does, really. Sometimes it's like flying. Sometimes, I look up at a clear blue sky and see a fighter jet going across it, and I think, I wish I was with you. And I think, no, you bloody don't, you silly old fool. You'll not get up there again. It's the same with journalism. I sometimes see a breaking story abroad, I suppose like Nairobi, and think, wow, wish I was there. And then I look at the claret on the table beside me.
And the bank account.
And the bank. Well, no, I wasn't going to mention that. I look at the big plasma screen. This is near enough. Thank you. I'll settle for that.
Yes. The next, please. Yes.
Hi, I'm slightly confused whether we're talking about crossing the line in just a negative sense of becoming partial, or crossing the line in a positive sense, like Freddie's story, getting involved enough to challenge the perceived wisdom and challenge the authorities. I just wonder whether there's more or less pressure now on journalists to follow an agenda, either because of their editors or because the government is pressuring them.
Can I just briefly say that the title is almost deliberately rhetorical, because since we didn't know what the line was, no one's ever defined the line, and turned out to be lots of lines, there is no perfect solution to this. But I mean, in terms of, Penny, you're
Penny's the only practicing journalist here.
Exactly, yeah.
Are you following an agenda?
No, but I think there is a danger that there is more pressure to cross lines, because there's so much information out there. We can no longer claim to be the first people to tell you something. I mean, a reporter used to tell you what's happened. That's what you sent me places to do, because I was the only person who got there and could say it. Well, now you can find out what's happened before you watch the news bulletin. So we're not telling you what's happened anymore. We have to add to it. So we've got all these live spots where people add meaning and add that extra stuff to it. If I want to know what's happening in Europe, I'll wait for James Mates to give me some sense of what's happening in Europe, or Lise Doucette to tell me, or Patrick Coburn. You need that brand, that expertise, and that's not exactly impartiality, but it's seasoned professional judgment. So there's more pressure for that from mainstream media, I think, than ever before, I would say. And also need to stand out in a world where everybody's kind of quirky, and we're celebrating lots of truths and lots of different angles. I think there can be pressure from editors to bring a kind of attitude and an involvement that we should be wary of.
I want to put James Mates on the spot. Yes.
Entirely endorse what Penny is saying. There is also now a slight cult of the celebrity journalists. You see a lot of journalists in inverted commas who've made significant names for themselves through social media, and I wonder, or at least I don't wonder, I think I know that this is a route. We've seen it in America, where the impartiality of American journalism, to my mind, is under grave threat from not just from Fox News and Talk Radio, but from the reaction that's set into that from MSNBC and from others who their route to ratings, to celebrity, to notoriety, to the book deal, to whatever else comes now, as much as anything else, from partiality rather than the noble art of impartiality that perhaps was more celebrated 20 years ago. We see it with Penny Red and Owen Jones and people like that who through social media, through no real practice of journalism as we've known it, but through a practice of advocacy, have themselves become celebrities in the social media / journalism sphere that we live in.
Aren't you a celebrity journalist yourself, James?
But I like to think that only because my face is on telly regularly and therefore I get recognised. I would hope. I mean, it is a point and it's a problem that when you appear on television a lot, people know who you are. But is that a celebrity because I'm which I've either actively sought or I'm trying to establish because I want to sell my point of view, or just because I'm on telly 3 nights a week?
No, it's an advantage. It gets you into places, doesn't it? Right. Anyone else? Yes. Yeah.
I'm rather curious in terms of when you speak about impartiality. You've all had your personal opinion on the atrocities you've witnessed. And so when it comes to Bosnia, there was a clear case of who was the victim. In Biafra, the same thing. I'm curious when it comes to the Palestine-Israel conflict, why is it that there is a sense of you have to have the two sides portrayed on the same level, where there is a clear case of an occupied people and an occupier? And it just made me think of the story a couple of years ago that broke, which were Reuters reporters who'd heard that Sarkozy and Obama had a conversation, complaining about Netanyahu. And the story for me wasn't as much that they complained, it's the fact that they kept the story for several days because they were too afraid to break it. So what exactly is the pressure when it comes to the Palestine-Israel conflict?
Go on, Professor of Journalism.
No, it's just that I happen to be on the panel created by the then BBC governors to review the BBC's coverage of Israeli-Palestinian, and our reporter, a chap called Quentin Thomas, was the chairman of that. I commend that report to you, partly because it came to a verdict which was not the perceived verdict. I think partly the panel was set up because there were allegations that the BBC's coverage was anti-Israeli. Actually, the conclusion we came to after lots of evidence was that it wasn't actually anti-Israeli, or if it was, it wasn't any more anti one side or another. What we pointed to, which I think is relevant to your question, was we felt that there was not enough coverage of what it was like to be in an occupied land, if you like, the occupied experience. I think Quentin Thomas had some particular phrase for it. And we made a number of proposals, one of which, for instance, that there should actually be a BBC correspondent on the West Bank. The BBC Gaza Bureau already existed. Of course, Alan Johnson was, soon after we reported, actually taken hostage by somebody. So, the risks of reporting that area. And I think, so I would stand by what we said there, that actually there is a way of reporting both sides, but occasionally you will point to the particular impact in a particular area. And it might be in Bosnia, what happened there. But I mean, I suppose I've come away from this. I once said that I was so obsessed with impartiality that I didn't vote in an election. That was when I was the editor of ITN. I didn't actually vote in any elections. It was also saved me going to the polling booth on a busy day. But and I now have become more sceptical about the due impartiality. I mean, I looked at the coverage of the Libyan war, and I actually asked at an event, is this coverage actually balanced between Gaddafi and pro and anti? And nobody on the panel at that event seriously claimed that it was. And yet my old colleagues at Ofcom later found the only people who had breached the impartiality rules on the coverage of the Libyan war was Russia Today. And I thought, that's interesting.
Yes. Right, second from the front here. Thank
you. Yeah, I mean, it's maybe a little bit relative to the Libya thing, but I wondered what your thoughts were on the pooling system for the press and how that affects these lines that you're talking about. And yeah, I read about the pooling system starting many years ago, and obviously that's really ramped up. And it seems to me it made reporting quite difficult to be impartial when you were effectively being censored by.
I'm going to abuse the chairman's role here. I actually, there are imposed pools and there are voluntary pools. I actually set up the first voluntary pool in Bosnia in April 1992, and I have no regrets because it saved the lives of the journalists. You mentioned Libya. Just look at what happened to Tim Hetherington. What a wonderful journalist and what a life wasted. Your thoughts on the Falklands, Freddie?
Well, we're talking about pooling. The armed forces have traditionally always loathed journalists. It's changing, but for a long time it was very traditional. And when the task force was about to set off for the Falklands, with only 7 or 8 days after the invasion by Galtieri, they were about to leave with no journalists on board. It was very nip and tuck. And I think it was Bernard Ingham who finally took an embassy from someone and went to Margaret Thatcher, and it was she who overruled Northwood and said, we're going to have some journalists on board. We can't conduct a war with no coverage. So a pool of, I think, 5 was selected, and there was, I think, they just had to file for everybody. And even then, what they filed was subject to military censorship. They were not allowed to say this, that, or the other, because clearly it would be intercepted by the Argentinians, and therefore they might know that we were going into this beach or not going into this beach or doing this or doing the other. So it was under constant pressure. But it was, I think, a good thing that we had people there. There would have been no coverage of that war without them, and yet there were only 5 of them. So sometimes it has to be a very small number who take the responsibility for covering virtually that campaign for the world, because everybody picked up their coverage.
It's a very good example, Freddie, because I was involved in the coverage of that, and the best example of what was absolutely military censorship by any by any definition was the Sir Galahad, the ship that went down. Again, for younger people here, basically. There were troop carriers bringing British troops ashore while Suffolk was halfway through the conflict, and the Argentinian Air Force hit them, and the ships went up in flames, and there was a terrible death toll. And there happened to be a pool crew there. It's actually a BBC cameraman, and he had with him Michael Nicholson of ITN, the pool reporter, and Brian Hanrahan of the BBC. And they sent back these reports. Now, the authorities had deliberately slowed the way the footage came back, so we didn't get it back for days. So all we had was the audio reports of what had happened. And I was in the kind of audio receiving room at ITN, and we heard Brian file his piece, and then we heard Mike Nicholson file his piece. And then this voice came on the line, and it said, Nicholson's okay, but Hanrahan's no. And we sort of thought, and then we listened to the two, and being an old operator, Mike's not here, is he? He had done a fairly straight report and then put an upbeat ending on it. So this was a day of tragedy, but I vouchsafe it was a day of bravery or some such phrase. And Brian hadn't done that. So Mike's went on the air, and I think the BBC had to run Mike's piece as well because they didn't have anything else. And that was, that wasn't about, giving away, essential information. It was about managing morale in the country. And there are a number of examples in the Falklands. So to that extent, I think you're right. I think a pool allows you to manage more easily. But as Martin says, there are other pools which actually save lives.
But better than nothing.
Can I be pedantic?
Yes.
Why not, Rob?
32 journalists.
Yes, I think probably in broadcasting.
Not 5.
No, but in broadcasting there were about 4 or 5.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
Newspapers count.
Absolutely.
Right, we've got one at the front here, please.
As a novelist, I don't have to worry too much about espionage laws, but I guess you guys do. And I remember back in the 60s, in Vietnam environment, the Rolling Stone had a list a mile long, including the Alsop brothers, Scotty Reston, who've been giving information. And now we have Miranda, and we have Bradley Manning. We have The Guardian running masses of stories for a whole year that were taken off Manning's documents. And yet some of them are they're being chased. I gather Sarah, who is number 2 to Assange, is now having something brought against her because of something she was doing on the web. She's a journalist. How do you all deal with the question that if you're out in the front lines, as businessmen very often are spies, aides and embassies are spies, how do you keep yourselves from becoming spies, and how do you deal with the espionage acts when you're being terrorized as Bush was terrorizing the American press in the early stages of his presidency?
Martin, why didn't you answer that? You've dealt with many of these people over the years.
You're being used a lot of the time, but it was another world. No, this book is really good on the espionage angle. There's a brilliant chapter on Guy Burgess. I suspect you're largely responsible for that. And when you do cross the line, because we live in a very murky world, now more than ever, and we always did. But I stick with the boss's comments here. In the end, at the end of a long or short career, if you can justify what you did to yourself, that's all right. Yes, just at the back. Yes, I don't want to.
This, we just want to take up the point that James made and put it to the panel about celebrity commentators, and really ask whether you think, from the public's perspective, because we've framed this very much from a journalist point of view on right and wrong, whether the public's actually changed their views on what they expect and what they want, and whether they're now better at accepting that the reports they get are going to have elements of bias and prejudice because they're used to reading on Twitter and Facebook, and whether therefore media organisations need to take that into account and adapt, because except for the BBC, many of them have to be quite accommodating for what their viewers, their readers want to see and hear.
Jeff, tell me heard from you.
Well, this is really about personality.
It's about celebrity journalism and.
There have been celebrity journalists in various guises, certainly throughout the period of our research. Walter Duranty, who reported from Moscow, was a celebrity journalist.
Very pro-Soviet.
We took 19.
He was also...
what year, Jeff? Do you want to tell people what year that was?
That was really from the early 20s through until the mid-30s. He was apparently, so it appears, part of a cover-up to deny that there was a serious famine. But nevertheless, his celebrity was such that because he had provided enough sort of reporting to support Franklin Roosevelt's policy of opening up diplomatic relations with communist Russia, that he was both praised by Roosevelt, he was praised by Stalin and given exclusive interviews, and the celebrity never left him. He had a band of loyal journalist friends and colleagues who supported him until he died. He ran short of money occasionally and they bailed him out. Celebrity helped him, but arguably the celebrity also helped obfuscate the fact that he crossed various lines that were very ethically dubious. There are other celebrity journalists who have also, I suppose, thrived through their celebrity. I would think that some celebrity journalists, for instance, are able to get entry into worlds that mere mortals such as I wouldn't, just because of their celebrity, because they're accepted. So I think celebrity helps, but whether celebrity is something that emerges from the quality of your work, or whether it's something that emerges because you seek celebrity, that really is down to individuals.
Stewart, why didn't you have a chapter on William Howard Russell, who was the ultimate celebrity journalist and the only one who ever brought down a prime minister?
Yeah. That is
Lord Aberdeen, actually.
Yeah. Because almost every history of journalism seems to start with him, I thought we'd start sort of somewhere else. Certainly, I think effectively our first one is a guy called Norman Ewer. In chronological order.
Yeah.
And Jeff again found some amazing files on him because rather like Burgess, he was often, sometimes simultaneously, the diplomatic correspondent to the Daily Herald, a Russian spy who ran a brilliant spying operation on MI5. To go to your point, he actually, whilst writing almost a daily piece, he had his own agents out spying on MI5. And then he did a complete volte-face and became a British government propagandist. So, I mean, these people, these celebrity journalists of their time, were nothing but flexible.
Can I tell you one of the little secrets? If you work for a big news organisation over a long period of years, one of the fascinating games is spot the spook. Who among your colleagues has actually got a back channel to someone? Yeah. You know, somebody who's sent for no apparent reason to all the dodgy places one after the other. Yeah. No names, no patron.
If you can't spot them, it's you.
Yes, that's right. Thank you. I've always worried about you, James.
Ask about RT. You quoted the what was it?
the
Libyan case.
The Libyan case, saying that it was believed to be the least impartial organisation. But I find RT far more impartial in the sense that it tells the truth about Syria, Libya, Palestine, Iraq, Iran, than the BBC or any of the other channels, because it's not allied to the very heavy lobby, mostly in America and to some extent in Britain, which is dominated by the Israeli lobby. And they are calling the shots in all those Arab, Semitic, if you like, countries, and putting us against them, which I think is stirring up trouble for the whole region. And I thought journalists in this sort of environment would be on the side of that kind of justice and truth. But you don't seem to be, with all due respect, respecting that.
No, I'm just observing the irony that when many British reporters acknowledged that, in a sense, the coverage was anti-Gaddafi, the only time that a regulator decided that the coverage broached the rules was when somebody did something which was pro-Gaddafi. And just as an irony. But to your point about Russia Today, I mean, I think it goes into this whole issue of these other channels and the other perspectives which they bring. And again, while I was at Ofcom, the difficulty in applying a code which was really meant for British channels reporting British events and particularly British politics being applied to when I was at Ofcom, I was actually responsible for the regulation of 2,000 TV and radio outlets in the UK, and many of them were outlets which actually barely passed through the UK. These people needed a license to transmit it around Europe, and they chose to be registered in the UK. And amongst them was obviously Al Jazeera English is regulated by Ofcom, Russia Today is regulated by Ofcom. There's a whole series of them, and you're trying to apply these kind of fine British traditions to Russia Today. Now, I happened to be awake at 5 o'clock this morning in a hotel room in Cardiff watching Russia Today. What a sad life I lead. And actually, what I saw at 5 o'clock in the morning, I think Ofcom should have a look at. So, I mean, look, none of these people are perfect. And if it weren't TV, if it weren't broadcasting, none of these rules would apply anyway, actually. If it was print, if it was on the internet only. But, these rules still apply, and there are many advantages to these rules. And James said, the impartial reporting is a fine tradition, but it's become increasingly difficult to actually apply it to some of these other channels.
Right. Yes?
Isn't the ultimate ethical question for a journalist out in the field, if you see somebody dying or somebody in danger, do you stop filming and help them?
I would like to ask Freddie about this. Freddie was the original frontline journalist.
I never had a camera. I'm not a photographer, I'm not a camera.
But did you help people?
Yeah, I mean, there were quite a group of us in Biafra who, I was a stringer. Okay, well, a stringer is the lowest form of human life in the journalistic chain. He's not actually employed by anybody, which is a disadvantage, but also an advantage because it gives a certain freedom. I don't have to follow editorial policy. I don't care whether it's Fox News or The Guardian. I don't have to be left. I don't have to be right. I don't have to say this because some editor tells me that that's what he wants. So there's a freedom there. The opposite of that, of course, is the complete irrelevance of anything you do or say. So I took this fact that I wasn't employed by anybody as giving me the freedom to say what I'm looking at, what I think about it, what I would like to do about it. And there were others like me like that. There was Lloyd Garrison. We used to go to Uli Airport, this bizarre sort of conversion from a strip of motorway into the only airport. The relief planes from Nordchurch Aid used to come in from mainly from Sao Tome, the Portuguese island offshore. It was all rather hairy because there was a prowling couple of MiG-17s up there flown by East Germans. And the only way that the relief plane could get in, usually they had a Scandinavian pilot, Finns, Swedes, Danes, Norwegians, they were Nordchurch Aid, was for the landing lights to go on for about 8 seconds. When this poor bastard was just hovering over the palm trees, waiting for a light in a completely pitch black sea of darkness, and suddenly, whoo, lights, bang, get it down, lights off. The lights were off before he stopped rolling. And then they used to roll round to the unloading area. But by this time, our friend upstairs, known as Genocide, that was his nickname, he'd obviously seen the flash of the lights. So he'd homed in. And the thing then was to try and get the ramps down and the 100 or 180 or 200 sacks, 100-weight sacks of relief food, mainly concentrated milk, off before the damn thing went up in a pyre of smoke. So we used to run up the ramp, and again, one of the guys inside would slap a 100-weight sack on our shoulders. I could carry a 100-weight, and they said, I'd hate to try it today, and run back down and into the cover of the trees and dump it before Genocide came back with his cannon. So that was, one tried to help in that way. There wasn't much, I mean, I'm not a medical man, so there was nothing I could do in the dispensaries or the clinics. The feeding centres were run by basically priests and nuns, some of whom were medically qualified. They ran those. All that really a guy with no qualifications who was trying to help in some way could do was just carry. Just be a beast of burden, get the stuff off the plains and into the shadow of the trees before Genocide came back. And just once, it got really, really dicey when there was a plane on fire. It had been hit coming in. The pilot had landed it, and it was brewing. And as you know, aviation gasoline is very, very volatile. So we were all running like little ants up and down this wretched ramp trying to get the stuff off before it brewed. And amazingly, I think somebody up there must have been looking after us, because they got the last of 240 sacks off the plane, and then it went whoop. And that was that.
Yes.
I would like to talk about two kind of theoretical issues, lines that talk to a lot of the things that have been discussed so far. One that occurs to me is the difference between institutional and independent journalism. And it strikes me from my quite extensive research that I've done on British foreign correspondent journalism that there are many more lines that can be crossed in institutional journalism. And so we need to think very, very carefully about what's the difference between, say, a bystander, an innocent witness, and somebody who is clearly professional and able in a particular regard, but that does shape the way they look at the world. Another line, of course, is the line between emotional attachment and something, shall we say, less emotionally attached. I'm very interested in the and respect the writing that Martin Bell has done in this regard, but I'm not aware of him updating his thesis as a BBC whistleblower. So, what would Martin? I'd really like to hear about that.
Well, I'm happy to say that I don't do self-promotion, but my book about the Bosnian War has just been republished with a new and updated introduction, which addresses these issues entirely. What about institutional lines, Stewart?
By institution, you mean the fact that people like Penny work for companies, do you, as opposed to being members of the public? Is that the point you're trying to make, or what?
At the risk of sort of bringing other names into the conversation that have been mentioned before, John Pilger is very outspoken about the difference between what he regards as an independent journalist. Whether he regards himself as such is probably open to debate. But yes, the idea that, you know, that it's a difficult area to talk about because there are huge cultural issues here where people, you know, the generation of journalists that I've interviewed Simpson and Pilger and Fergal Keane and Alan Little and so on, they have no training, but what Pilger's mantra is very much it's the background of these people and the way they look at the world that's never critiqued. And we brought in the other voices of Al Jazeera and RT, and you describe them as other perspectives. Well, maybe it's about time that we also saw objectivity and its kind of colonialist alignment as also being, a perspective. You know, objectivity is a partiality as much as any other.
Yeah. And we haven't even mentioned Fisk yet. How can that be?
Absolutely.
What about opinionated journalism, Stewart? Come on.
Well, I'm interested to get Penny's perspective on this because she's doing a bit. To briefly make the point, I mean, take Jon Snow as an example. Jon Snow says, I am not impartial. I bring to my reporting the views of a white male of a certain age, of a certain education, or something. He declares all his previous convictions, if you like, and yet he works in an institution. So I'm not sure that belonging to an institution or being paid by an institution is necessarily the kind of constraint you say it is. I mean, Pilger worked for ITV and the Daily Mirror, both fairly mainstream kind of media organisations, but that didn't stop him doing what he did. So, but Penny, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, by objective, which is different to impartial, and you're very good on this book, I think it's Richard Sambrook who makes it.
Richard Sambrook, yeah, he's...
impartial is bias, and objective is evidence-based. Yeah. So, you can see when you see me on television that I'm a woman. I mean, if I was doing a piece, for example, about sexual exploitation, I think that the fact that and I think my editor would assign women and men, actually, interestingly, controversially, to different stories because of their sex, and possibly because of their age too, because I would bring a different and more grown-up take on something than somebody younger, and somebody younger might have more vigour and sort of tenacity, possibly knocking on doors now. But you can see who I am and what I am, and I think that's one of the advantages of broadcasting, is you do wear your history in your face and your experience. But I don't think you can leave it behind. I think one of the problems that broadcasters have is not just due impartiality, and the book says, what is it really? But it's also that the agenda is so narrow now, which I regret. And that's something that's happened in the modern world of social media. It seems to me that my children's agenda is much broader than the news we're feeding them. No matter who's giving it to them, our agendas are too small. And that's part of the bigger disconnect, I think, between Westminster and the public and our journalism and the public. But I don't think you can rule us out just because we're kind of who we are. We advertise that, as Jon Snow does.
Yes.
Just going back to the question of the trial, and you said when the doctor testified, there wasn't a single journalist at the proceedings.
Yeah.
I was wondering what you attribute the lack of interest to, because to me it would seem that a war crimes trial in Europe in our lifetime would warrant, or should have warranted, a significant amount of coverage.
It's an interesting point. What happened on that was that the magazine had gained certain friends in the media. Obviously, I've mentioned some of them. Some of them worked for other news organisations, and on the first day, these news organisations turned up. And basically, I'm sure their news agenda said, ITN in trouble, ITN to be found to be faking. That was the story they turned up for. They didn't turn up for a story ITN found not guilty of faking, if you like. But as the case began to go through, and all these witnesses we put up, I think it became pretty clear that we hadn't faked it, and people didn't bother to turn up. But one organisation, I won't name them, but they know who they are, were there every day trying to get stories against ITN. On the day that doctor was scheduled to appear, that reporter did not come to the court. So I don't know why. I rang his news organisation. I said, gosh, he didn't come today. Why would that be? Oh, we wanted him to come back and prepare for the backgrounder at the end of the case. So who will know why he wasn't there that day? But in fairness to everyone else, if I'm being fair, they decided it wasn't much of a story at the end of the day.
But you had to go to the BBC on the conclusion, didn't you?
Well, what then happened, and this is where, I almost have to confess my sort of, my crimes here against the convention. Having taken a small magazine to a libel court, having then been fined so much by the jury that they went out of business, when I heard the BBC's version of the end of the trial, I realised that was misleading because they'd implied that we went on a technicality. So I rang, actually, Richard Sambrook, who's not, and I said, Richard, that's not what the judge said. They actually quoted the judge as saying, and he never said that. And he said, well, we won't repeat it at 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock, whatever it was in those days. And I said, well, that's not enough, really. You've actually transmitted that at 6 o'clock. So I then committed the next sin of taking the BBC to what was then called the Broadcasting Standards Council. And I can remember the kind of Perry Mason in me. Now, I guess that shows my age. Perry Mason was a famous kind of American courtroom drama. I remember my opening line to the Broadcasting Standards Council, I read the quote and I said, "Did the judge use those words? No. Did the judge use any of those words? No." And we won the case, and the Broadcasting Council upheld what we said, and the BBC had to transmit an apology. And I think at that point the saga was finally over, and until John Simpson apologised that many years later. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Sorry, it's not really a question, it's a comment. And it's really unfair because I haven't read what's in your book. And
But you will.
Okay, yeah, sorry. And I meant to introduce myself. I'm Michaela Wrong, and I used to work for the FT and Reuters, so I've too worked for big organisations. I don't really think that this evening you've addressed the matter of money, which of course goes to the heart of it all. Most of you have worked for really big institutions. Freddie was obviously a very brave exception to that. Who pays your trip? Makes massive difference to your perspective. And it's not a question of being bribed or twisted or told what to say. It's how you see the world. And if you go and see part of an Angolan diamond mining field because you've hitched a lift with a diamond company, and if you go and see it with Oxfam, or if you go and see it on your own, you're going to have three completely different perspectives. And increasingly, as people cover foreign news, and there's less and less money being spent, and there's less and less room for independent journalists to operate because the money just isn't there, this is the key issue. Where's the money coming from? How do you get to these stories? And I think the problem is that you guys, a lot of you have worked with really big organisations with big pockets, but out there now, there's really not room for independent journalists to get to these stories. How did you cover Darfur? You either went in with a refugee organisation, with an aid organisation, or you went in with the rebels. Neither of those are independent perspectives.
Yeah. Can I just say, you might want to read the Lindsay Hilsum chapter about Rwanda then? Because I think that answers some of your points. But I take your point, I agree with your point, basically.
And it's a very good point. We're running, as they say, out of time. Let's just go around this panel one more time. Conclusions and final thoughts. Penny.
I think my final thought is you want the sort of journalists who cross lines, because the best journalists, by their very nature, have the arrogance and the confidence to do that and bring people in Biafra to account, governments to account. And they also need to have the humility to talk to the victims. But you need the sort of characters who, when they cross lines, know that they're doing it, admit that they're doing it, and can explain afterwards and justify why. And that needs age, maturity, experience, great management, money from honourable sources, and transparency. And just to pick up your point, so if you are on Oxfam-funded trip, you say so. I think in the case of my company, we go on less trips, but we don't take funded trips for the reasons that you say. But seasoned correspondents who cross lines and do so with transparency and, where possible, honour.
Jeff, your final thoughts?
I think one of the issues about crossing lines for journalists is that at some point, if you've crossed a line that is at all dubious, that probably you have taken a view about rather than just crossed inadvertently, you'll eventually get found out by someone like me, because I'll find out about it in the archives. But moreover, what certainly continually surprised me in my visits to the archives is that government really does try to strong-arm journalists quite a lot, quite unmercifully. And this is something that, as a member of the public, I have not necessarily been greatly aware of. When I was researching Freddie's files in the Foreign Office, it's quite clear that a number of journalists are subjects for attention because they've not been following the approved government line. And occasionally they've been pulled in and giving a going over, to quote one particular file. And when confronted with that, you've actually got to have a lot of brass neck really to withstand that pressure. And moreover, everyone on this panel apart from me has been in a war zone at some time or other. The closest I've been to a war zone was in an outhouse when someone threw a brick through a window when I was a kid. And I just couldn't imagine what I would do when bullets are flying and bombs are going off. What on earth I would think about other... I certainly wouldn't be thinking about ethical principles. I'd be thinking about what am I seeing, and let's just get my head down.
To add to Penny's list of qualities, I would add supremely bloody-mindedness. One of the most gifted, bloody-minded journalists I ever met was Freddie Forsyth. Freddie, some closing thoughts, please.
Yeah. Well, yes, I don't think there's probably any major story that you can cover which is completely devoid of any bias at all. It's extremely hard to avoid bias. I think Reuters, which I worked for 4 years, does a pretty bloody good job of not being biased. But there's almost always two sides to every story. There was a Serbian defence side, if you like. They too had atrocities committed by Croats against them. There were, yes, I'm sorry to say to the lady at the back there is a case for Israel. The only creed I ever came across which had absolutely no mitigating factor whatsoever was Nazism. As a kid born in '38 and raised through the war and after the war, obviously I knew a bit about it, and it was very nasty. It wasn't until I investigated it more deeply when I was researching the Odessa file that I found out exactly how foul it was. And most things you can say, well, maybe there's one mitigating factor, not that one. That's the only one. This has got nothing. Not even communism, can have a case made for it. But as to working for or rebelling against the establishment, I mean, sometimes I think that the establishment is not the friend of dispassionate reporting. It can't be, because it wants a version, its version, to dominate, and that could well be the wrong version. One last anecdote, if I may. I was well smeared by the Foreign Office publicity department when I was out of the country. Obviously, I was down in the bush, but they had a good go at me. I became a mercenary. I became Majuku's personal advisor, which I wasn't. We chatted, but I wasn't his advisor. No, I wasn't a mercenary. I was an arms dealer. No, I wasn't an arms dealer. It was many things, but I was apparently all of these things. So when I came back, I was so well smeared that the only chance I had, I'm talking about the early spring of 1970, of getting a job in journalism was a pretty faint hope. So, nil desperandum, I sat down and wrote a thing called The Day of the Jackal. And when it was published, I walked past the Foreign Office and I went, and I have a mental image.
Thank you.
Lots of little youngsters going back and saying, "Sir, there's a man outside on Whitehall raising a middle finger at us."
Stewart, last word with you.
I can't top that. I can't top that. But I would say that the only trouble we had with the lawyers on this book was the hackers chapter, where frankly we were just trying to summarise, but actually because the trials are about to start and wouldn't let us do that basic stuff. All I would wonder is what is going to come out and the trials that are about to happen. If we were to have this event in 6 months' time, it would be a very interesting event as well.
Thank you all for coming. It's a terrific book. I think it's on sale. I think it's been really useful, and my thanks to all the panellists, and thank you.
Thank you.